Okay. So, hi, everyone. This is lecture uh, 9 for the death and dying, the last lecture for the final exam. You guys ready? Oh, good. And now I'm losing my voice. Great. So, uh, we're talking about end of life. So, first, you should realize that there are different definitions for death. So, functional death is very straightforward. There's no heartbeat, there's no breathing. Versus brain death, which is just the brain activity has stopped. There are no, electrical waves, but the body itself may be functioning. So we're going to look at the uh, way that people at different ages view death, realizing that like children usually don't have a real concept of death until about the age of 5. So you have to be careful what you say. Like if you say, oh, grandma, is just sleeping, the child could actually develop a fear of going to sleep. So you have to be very careful on how you talk to them. And, you'll have just as many psychologists that say, yes, you should take them to the funeral home to kind of say a final goodbye, and others that will say no. Just let them remember grandma, grandpa, whoever, the way that they knew them. So there's no definitive method. So typically it's left up to the parents of what they think that their child can handle at whatever age they are. But they really don't have any real understanding that death is permanent until after 5. So when we talk about death in infancy or childhood, miscarriage. So uh, if anywhere in the pregnancy, the developing zygote embryo fetus is unable to survive, the body actually will cause a spontaneous abortion. Sudden infant death syndrome is a real psychological issue that can happen anywhere within the first year. They don't have any exact reason why it happens, even though they have had some research studies that show smoking can increase the chances. And that's not only smoking of the mom, but it's secondhand smoke. So it's one of the reasons, you know, other than other things that can occur if mom who's pregnant is smoking. But it's one of the reasons that they strongly suggest that women who are pregnant do not smoke and that no one in the household smokes. So if there is someone, at least to step out of the house. So the mom is not breathing in that smoke, or once the baby is home, the baby is not bringing in that smoke. But it can occur anytime in that first year. And psychologically, it's extremely difficult for parents. Here you had this beautiful, wonderful, healthy baby when they went to bed, and you wake up the next morning and they're dead, with no cause. So um, a lot of parents who have a death of a child end up breaking up because of how they're trying to handle this. And people handle death differently, but it's one of those big things that relationships have a really hard time coming back from if that happens. Um, and there's no time like processing this information. Some people can do it a couple months, some people never, ever are able to get out of it. So most people who've had a child die from SIDS or just a child die in general have a need for some additional counseling, some bereavement therapy, um, even possibly medication to help them get through this. Accidents are the most frequent cause of death during childhood. The number of children who are victims to homicides have actually tripled since the 60s. And that's from 2020, and I'm betting it's more than that. Our young people are dying in a lot of different ways. So, as I said before, children don't really have that concept of death until about the age of 5. And around 5, they have the understanding that death is irreversible. By the age of 9, they are able to comprehend that this is going to happen to people. It's not something that they did. They can have a very difficult time if, you know, they got in a fight with their parents and their mom is in an accident and dies, and then they're like, "Oh, it was because of me." Adults even think that and will ruminate on that, but it's much more difficult for a child. Middle childhood, they have more of an understanding what the customs are of a particular culture. The whole idea of laying out a body, viewing the body, etc. Why flowers are given, whatever religious tradition you're in, the type of ceremony that they may have, that also is something that they can start to understand. They understand cremation and they understand cemeteries and the purpose of a cemetery or the purpose of an urn with the ashes. And what comes to mind, and it's slightly different, but you've been hearing on the news about that undertaker who uh, does cremations for animals, for dogs. And it was found out that, he has all these charges against him that he was just dumping the dogs' bodies, especially the small ones, and then cremating the larger ones, and then using some of the ashes from the larger dogs to put in containers for the small dogs so he wouldn't have to pay as much. So people don't even know if their pets are actually their pets' ashes. You know, just imagine if an undertaker of humans did that. Not knowing, is that really dad? Is that really mom? Is that my child? Etc. Death in adolescent, when we talk about young people at adolescence dying, we already know personal fable. If you remember from when we did adolescence, personal fable, they don't think they can die. And it's very hard on other adolescents if a friend of theirs dies for whatever reason, whether it was suicide or if it was an accident, whatever the reason, shooting, it's very difficult. How could they be dead? They're my age. It really does strike them as being something impossible, that it should not happen, because they think that they can do anything. They're young. They're not going to die. Terminal illness, again, for young people, the thought that they may have cancer, that they're going to die, and they're 15, and there's nothing that can be done, is an unimaginable, almost a torture for them to go through. They become very depressed. They can become very anxious, and of course, extremely, extremely moody. The mood swings all over the place here. Death in young adulthood, it's the prime of your life. We're talking you guys right here. Who would ever think that someone, your age is gonna walk out the door and get hit with a bus and they did nothing wrong and it just happens. So it's also very, very difficult for people to believe that young adults, for whatever reason, um, it can cause a lot of anger, it can cause a lot of impatience, and the family just needs to be there for that person as best that they can. Death in middle adulthood, not as surprising, because at middle adulthood, you've lived half of your life. It's not, unheard of that you may have lung cancer while you smoke for, 10 years. Okay. You knew that was a possibility. It was a choice. But it's also the age where most adults fear death. They're still kind of in the prime of their life. They have a family, they have parents, and it can be a real struggle trying to deal with that. Heart attack and strokes are the most frequent causes at this particular age group. Late adulthood, people at late adulthood realize they're going to die. I mean, it's imminent. You open, the obituaries, and people you went to school with have passed away. I used to say to my parents when I was a teenager, why do you read the obituaries every single day? And they're like, well, we need to know if one of our friends has passed away. And I'm like, oh, that's so morbid. But I find myself reading the obituaries online at least once a week because people that I went to school with, I'm going to be 66 next next Tuesday. So hopefully I'll still be here. But this is a person you sat next to in class. They're the same age as you. You know, they were healthy and they're deceased. And if we understand that's going to happen as we get older, but as medicine has gotten better, culture in general has gotten better. People aren't working in factories starting at the age of 12. You know it's going to happen, but you don't think it's going to happen that soon. I can remember my father passing away at 68. He had just retired 2 years before that. My mom passed away at 73. So I'm going to be 66. And I'm like, getting a little closer to those ages. Hoping that I take after my one aunt who lived to be 90. Not that I necessarily want to live to be 90, but I'm still working. I'd like to have a retirement, have some time, maybe travel. But I know it's going to happen. There's no miracle cure for most of the diseases that are out there, but not as anxious as in middle adulthood. And the problem with some of the theories, like the Kubler-Ross, and I like her theory, but it's assuming you're going to die. How many people just drop dead, or they're walking around, they have cancer that is spread through their whole body, but they don't have any symptoms. So they don't even know they're going to die to be upset about dying. So main causes in late adulthood: stroke, cancer, heart disease, and there's a thing called terminal decline. Um, what we see is a marked change in the body, in the health, in the mind, etc. And usually after we see this drop, it's within the next 2, 3, 4 years that the person passes. So people at our age start to look for that, especially if you have grandparents and you notice that they really have kind of gone downhill. They're more than just forgetful. Their health is failing. Okay. The paleontologists are people who study death and dying, and we are doing what we say you should do, which is actually have death education to actually talk about death and dying. There actually is a course here at CCAC. I know you're going to just be so thrilled after tonight's lecture. You're going to just run and register it for, the fall, on death and dying. That's the entire course, death and dying. I've never had to teach it. I hope I don't have to. It would be a very hard course to teach, but a real necessity, especially if you're in the medical, field, because you're going to be dealing with death every day. Somebody somebody who's your patient will die, and at different ages. Working at Mercy Hospital, I, you know, help people get in and find where they're going, and we get to see the ages. We don't know their conditions, we just know what room and their age. And you'll see someone who lived to be 98 and has 12 kids and has 45 grandchildren, and and great grandchildren, and all coming because they're late 90s. There's a good probability they're not getting out of the hospital. But at the same time, you have someone who's 28 years old who got shot and is now paralyzed from the neck down. And they aren't responding. The sense of difference visiting that person, you can just see it in the visitor's face. Just the disbelief. They look for any little clue that maybe they'll get a little better. But many times there aren't any clues of them getting better. So teaching about death is perfectly natural as the ending for this course on human growth, because we are all going to die. So understanding it, how, people choose to die. We're going to talk about a DNR. People who are terminally ill deciding where they want their life to end and how they want to be remembered. They have a chance to make some choices, and don't wait until you're older. If you are sure you do not want extraordinary means, then you need to write it down. And in this PowerPoint, I include a living will. So you actually could print this out and make a living will for yourself and decide who you would want as your, medical power of attorney, because someone's going to have to make the decision. And if you have a big family, that can be very difficult. This person doesn't want to do this person wants to do this, etc. When my mom was dying, it was me. I'm an only child, so the decision came down to me. So I didn't have to fight siblings. Her sisters were still alive, but they said, you're the daughter. I'm like, yeah, I have the medical power of attorney, to make those decisions. But my mom made it easy because she had a do not resuscitate. So when my mom was beginning to fail, the hospital had called me and said, well, we're going to be putting her on, a ventilator. I'm like, no, check her chart. She has a DNR. And they checked her chart and it was there. So she lived 3 days after that phone call, and went peaceably, through that. Kubler-Ross is the most famous, the steps to death and dying. She says that everyone goes through these stages. That's one of the arguments or criticisms against Kubler-Ross. Not everyone goes through these stages. And especially if you don't know you're dying, you're not going to go through these stages, because it's going to happen. But denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, you should know those 5 stages. You should know them in that order. Denial is pretty straightforward. You I can't be dying. Doctor, I'm going to get a second opinion. I'm going to get a third opinion. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. Denying that it's happening to you or happening to a loved one. Anger, exactly that. You kind of come back. No, this is wrong. It can't happen to me. I'm a good person. Anger. Bargaining. This is like, please God, I just want to make it to my son's high school graduation. I'll do anything. I'll give money to the church. I'll give money to, nursing homes. I'll do whatever you want me to do. Just let me live longer. Bargaining. They'll bargain with the doctors. They'll bargain with anyone. Just let me live a little longer. And then depression. At that point, realizing, okay, there's nothing else I can do. And they can be in this depression time, a good bit of this time while they're waiting to die. And if they are well-rounded and they have a supportive family, they may accept their death. And then they have and it sounds weird, but they have a happy death. They're okay with it. Sometimes they're better off than the family. They're okay. It's like, it's okay. I'll be fine. They may even hang in there long enough so they're sure that their family's okay, to the point that the family has to say, it's okay if you want to, we're okay. And surprisingly enough, they tend to die fairly quickly after that. So the little graph on the next slide gives you that where we are kind of psychologically through those stages if we follow those stages. But again, pros, yeah, we see this pattern, and she was one of the first people to even talk about death. Her book was a bestseller because nobody wanted to talk about death, but she did it in a nice logical fashion. And this is what she saw in her research. And it made people more aware of what needs to be done, how it's handled, how they can move through this with the person who's dying, and where to go after it's done. The cons, and there are some cons. Okay, so again, it's limited only to people who know they're dying, and people suffering from diseases you don't know. I mean, new treatments come up, case studies, they try, um, radiation and chemo, and many times it's the radiation and the chemo that actually is the thing that kills the person. It's not the cancer, the leukemia, it's the treatment that may have kept them alive a little longer, but not enough to save their life. The stages, again, and how long it is between each stage, it depends on the person, it depends on the illness. It doesn't include anything about the anxiety level of the person who's dying or the anxiety level of the people who are with that person who's dying. And you get different people based on their personality, some will even maybe yearn for the end to happen, especially if they're in pain. And I always tell my students, there's no reason anybody should be in pain. We have some really awesome drugs. Now, that may put that person in almost like a comatose state, but they're not in pain. And we also know that if you increase pain meds, eventually it's the pain meds that are going to kill them. If they're supposed to be getting morphine every 4 hours, but now they're in pain every 3.5 hours, the doctor will say, to the family, well, we can make it every 3.5 hours or every 3 hours, but it may increase the likelihood of them dying sooner, but you don't want them in pain. So you say yes. And then they start to be in pain after 2.5 hours. But now they're giving the pain meds every two. So the closer those pain meds are together, eventually it's really the pain medication that's going to cause the person to die. It's not like active euthanasia where you suffocate a person with a pillow or you give them an injection or an overdose of barbiturates. No, it's you're making sure that they're not in any pain. So DNR, again, does stand for do not resuscitate. That means um, no extraordinary means should be uh, carried out in order to save their life. Um, and it's really a variety of different ways to look at it. I can remember my mom, I use her because again, I lived through that, and you're kind of young to know this. Um, she wasn't eating. She wasn't able to swallow. So she was going to have a feeding tube. And when I asked the doctor, I said, she has a DNR, but, how long are we talking if we don't put the feeding tube in? They said, well, as long as she's hydrated, she could live 6, 7 months. It's like, I'm supposed to starve my mother for 6 months. Put the feeding tube in, you know. Um, Decisions are made, based on, communicating with the family. My mom didn't have a problem with me having the feeding tube in. It wasn't the thing that ended up killing her, but, it ended up being her diabetes. And then she had a heart attack. So. Living wills. So living wills give you more control over what you want to happen, or your family. And you definitely want to have these drawn up and notarized prior to you having any type of pain meds like morphine, etc. Because then they say you're not lucid, you're not really thinking with your own mind. So, even like a regular will, once this is happening, you're not going to be able to change that. So if there are any changes you need to make or anything that you need in place, things that you want done, then you need to make sure that it's put in that living will while you're still healthy. Which is hard to believe that you have to do that, but that's the truth. A healthcare proxy and your durable power of medical power of attorney is the same thing, basically. It's someone who's going to make decisions when you are unable to make those decisions. And then the next 2 pages is the actual living will. That's what it looks like. And you would just fill that out and go get it notarized. And you don't have to get a lawyer, and you can just literally go to a notary and have it notarized, signed by 2 people. Okay. So euthanasia, big word. It's also known as mercy killing, ending someone's life purposely. So that would be what we would call active euthanasia. Jack Kevorkian, I'm sure you've heard that name. He was known as Dr. Death. He believed that people had the right to end their life if they were in pain. And he would travel all over the country helping people to end their life. He, of course, went to jail for many counts of murder because at that time, no states had suicide as something that you could do. In most cases, with the exception, I believe, of Oregon, since it's legal in Oregon, not euthanasia per se by somebody else, but a person can choose to end their life in Oregon. They have to be a resident of the state for a year. They have to have 2 doctors confirming that they're going to die within a year and that there's nothing that can be done. They have to also have a psych evaluation to prove that they are of sound mind. And if all those hoops have been jumped through, the person goes to a doctor. The doctor fills out a prescription that is taken to the pharmacy. The person themselves takes it to the pharmacy. They are given an overdose of barbiturates, and they can go home or go wherever they would like to pass. And they take the pills and they're dead within 2 to 3 hours with no pain. That law has been rescinded, put back, rescinded, put back. And there are other states also now that give that as an option. In those states, your insurance will pay if you commit suicide in that method. Other states, if you commit suicide, you don't get that life insurance policy because it's considered murder and you chose to do it. So passive euthanasia versus voluntary active euthanasia. Now, are there times where a sibling or a spouse may choose to go beyond that and they want to end that person's life? That would still be murder. You know, if the person themselves didn't say, yes, I want to pass. I don't want this anymore. Home care, you know, alternative to being in a hospital. Most people would like to be around family or friends. So many decide that they would like to go home instead of spending their remaining days, weeks, months in a hospital. So they have visiting nurses, they have hospice. And hospice care, these are special people. If you know anyone who's a hospice nurse, give them a hug. So you know exactly. Yeah, it's really hard because you know you get very close to these people because they need help and support. And there are some days that they're really you would never know. They're perfect. And then there are other days you can just see them going downhill. And they're special people because they know their patients are going to die. It's just a matter of when. So you can be in a unit, like a hospice unit, in a facility. You can be a nurse who goes to the home at a regular schedule, and they will stay with your loved one while you get a break. Because if you're taking care of a loved one who's dying at home, you don't get too many breaks. So it gives them a chance to go out and have a nice dinner or just do something other than, I'm sorry, I know this is really hard for you. I'm sorry. You okay? Okay. Yeah,
Like experience it and realize that, yeah, we're all gonna die one day.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
wild.
Yeah, and I'm sure, you know, being in your situation where you're seeing it every day, you also see all the different reactions of family members too. You'll have family members that will not come. They don't want to see their loved one die. They say they can't handle it. And trying to explain to that loved one why their loved ones aren't there, you have to do some creative lying because you don't want them to feel like they're alone. Um, so you may spend more time with that person, or you have volunteers that come to sit with people. And I think it's called, is it NODA? I think it's NODA. It's a group of volunteers that will come and sit with people who are in critical condition or dying, and they have no family. And they go, usually a hospital has like a bag of like books they can read or music that they can play or things like that. And they take that bag up to the room and they spend maybe 2, 3, 4 hours with that person so they don't die alone. And it's just a really, that's another special kind of person to be able to do that, so that person doesn't end up dying alone. And dealing with, grief and the death of a loved one is very hard. In Western culture, we live so much longer than other parts of the world. When you think, yeah, 100 years ago, people were dying by the age of 40. That was perfectly normal, in the 1900s. But now, they're 40. That's half a life. They had so much to live for. Whereas, um, earlier that was, and it same thing for women in childbirth. It's like 1 in 4 women died giving birth to their child. So, we don't expect death to occur at a younger age. It's not something that we want to see happen. And because of that, it makes grief so much harder to deal with. The cost of a burial, and this is probably higher than this also, but again, this is the research from 2020. The average funeral and burial cost are $7,000. My mom, so she died in 93. It was $8,000 because we had the viewing for 2 days, because she, like my father, they both died on a Labor Day weekend. So not a lot of their friends would know that they died. So we had an extra day to try to get a hold of people and contact them so they would have the opportunity to pay the last respects. Well, that's like an extra $1,500 to have someone laid out an extra day. You may have your burial plots already. My parents, different generation, they were married in 47. My parents bought each other their burial plot for their wedding. Till death do you part. So, when my dad died, we had the plot already. When my mom died, she's laid out right next to him. And I have the plots behind them. So, even just to open the vault to put the casket in it is like $700. And you're not even talking about a headstone or anything else that you want to do special. So a lot of people have been going cremation. It's much cheaper. You can take the ashes home. They have vaults. Most cemeteries now have, a place where you can put the urns. It's not as expensive as getting a casket and a headstone, but they're, you know, different people have different tastes. And you also have to realize, what you want, even basic things like, if you bring their clothes to be laid out in, instead of having to buy an outfit off of the undertaker, you'll save yourself $300. Or to fix their hair a certain way. They have, barbers, beauticians that will come in and do that, but you pay for that. So you pay for like almost everything extra. So there are different norms, different customs, and the way we grieve. Anybody who's Jewish, they sit Shiva. So their way of mourning is to sit and talk about the person, their loved one, to sit with a group of friends and talk about that person and all the memories that they have. The old Irish tradition, you actually had the person laid out in your living room, and people partied and they celebrated the person's life. And now, we're like, oh, but it depends on your culture, and it depends on your tradition, and it depends on what part of the world you're in. Bereavement is that acknowledgement that someone has experienced a death and the grief that you feel because of that death is a real loss. And, we talk about Kubler-Ross's stages of death. Well, grief is the same way. Denial, it happened, anger, why did they have to die? Bargaining, if I would have just done this, maybe I could have had them live a little bit longer. Depression, and depression can last a little bit of time or a really long period of time. And then acceptance. Some people never get to acceptance. Some people don't. They will grieve the rest of their lives. There are bereavement groups out there for the survivors to try to get through that. I always tell people the best thing you can do for someone, if you know someone has lost a family member or a close person, a friend, is be there, of course. It doesn't matter what you say, just being there with them is important. But about 6 months after, this is when everyone else has kind of gone on with their lives and they forget that you're still grieving. Make a date with that person to take them to lunch or sit down and talk to them or spend some time together. That experience that somebody remembered, not only them. Because people do move on with their lives, and it's not as easy for the person who actually lost a loved one. So is it complicated grief or is it prolonged grief? Some people do get over it a lot quicker. Others go on for years. And as I said, some people never get over it. About 15 to 30% show deep depression following the loss of a loved one. And how they experience that loss is going to be just as unique as people's personalities are. There is a greater risk of death for a widow in a marriage. I don't know if you've ever heard of sweetheart syndrome, where the spouse or the significant other dies within a year of their significant other. My aunt passed away, and my uncle, who was perfectly healthy, passed away 39 days later. So it does happen. And quite frequently, now that we recognize it, we can label it. Depression, if you're already anxious, if you already have any insecurities, if you're already depressed, if you're already anxious, if you have bipolar disorder, if you have any of the major disorders, dealing with a death can be very, very, very difficult. So some people do need those support groups. Many churches of many denominations have support groups. They're called bereavement groups. They meet once a month. They share a meal and they help each other get through it. And that is it. So let me stop the share here. So for our test next week, we have middle adulthood, late adulthood, death and dying. That's the topic. It's multiple choice, okay, about 40 questions roughly, so it shouldn't take you too long. They're equally spread out, like there's not more on death and dying. Like when we did adolescence, there were a lot more questions on adolescence than they were the other, but this is kind of evenly spread out. Know those vocabulary words. The vocabulary words will be important. And that's it for tonight.